today we are particularly happy to welcome Professor Lewis from the University of Edinburgh. As you have realized, we're building the important connection with the University of Edinburgh. So the setup of the Professor Lewis is visiting us as a professor for our research program on slavery and race in the Mediterranean. We were ambitious when we see from the videos, but I promise we are going to get into if you just bear with us. Professor Lewis is currently one of the most distinguished experts in Greek slave systems worldwide. He's 2008 new book, Greek slave systems in the Mediterranean context, has finally broken the isolation, the ring fencing of Greek and Roman slavery that had been very authoritatively built by modern students. Showing that in fact supposed correlated difference between Greek and like essentially Roman state systems and other forms of Swedish exploitation in the Mediterranean was based on some misunderstandings and some avoidance of evidence perhaps. And in fact, we are looking now at a landscape in which systems of enslavement in the ancient Mediterranean can once again be looked at as a landscape that includes not only Greeks and Romans, but also cultural neighbors from the Caliphate in the West, all the way to this period. And more for most of our period where we looking at will be the Athenian Empire, the Persian Empire in the East. Professor Lewis has published extensively, has more than 40 articles on different aspects, both of slave systems in the ancient Mediterranean and also of more broadly economic life, both the way in which slavery was part of the ancient Mediterranean economy, and also more broadly landscape of labor, this afternoon, talking about the key aspects that actually somewhat overlooked in research on ancient slave systems, mainly slave trade. He's looking at how enslaved people came into the Greek world and the extent to which the phenomenon of enslavement was connected, as we have been exploring now, connected to notions of group arguments, group discrimination, of the story. The title of the paper is The Slave Trade Nation Greeks and the Emergence of Discourses of Power. We have 2,200 copies. And without further ado, I give it to Professor Lee. Welcome to the meeting.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Well, thank you to Nino, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very honored and I'm pleased to be here, and to Virginia and the colleagues at the Fondazione for organizing so well all the logistical side of my visit. I'll begin with an episode from the very end of the 5th century BC, which took place, I have a cursor, doesn't matter. There's a blob, okay. Which took place on the southern coast of the Black Sea in the mountainous hinterland that lay behind the Greek harbour town of Trapezus, and is known to us from the writings of Xenophon. The Greek mercenary army, defeated at Cunaxa, had made its tortuous way homewards and now stood poised to cross a river valley. Blocking its advance was a force of armed Anatolians who assailed the Greeks with missiles and abuse in their own tongue. At that point, a man came forward with a proposal for resolving the standoff without bloodshed. He was, so we were told, a peltast, and had lived as a slave in Athens. He recognized the foreigner's language as his mother tongue, though he did not know their name, and he proposed interceding with them, and once given permission, did just that, reconciling the Macrones, for so they were called, with the Greek army, arranging safe passage through Macronian territory. This episode stands at the juncture of the twin themes that I'll discuss today. And the first is the slave trade as an historical phenomenon, a system of merchants, markets, and buyers that was linked with and indeed stimulated a system of violence and captivity in the hinterland zones of the Greek world's periphery. And this system set in motion a pattern of economic currents across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, a commercial undertow that dragged into its vortex the vulnerable and the victims of war and debt, moving them often great distances to new lives in the households of Greek owners. Men, women, and children, like the Macronian Peltas, were frog marched down to the coast in coffles, much like the stock in trade of Aulus Caprelius Timotheus, himself a former slave turned somodemperos, literally a body merchant, whose sphere of operation was the Strymon River Valley in the early years of the Roman era. You can see here the man himself leading a couple of slaves to market in the lower register of this grave stele, his grave stele, and found early in the previous century at Amphipolis in northern Greece. Only this fragment of the stele survived the devastation of World War II and can be seen today in the Kavala Museum. But you can clearly make out a line of captives roped or chained by the neck, and the exception of the children in the bottom left-hand corner of the register, who are not restrained. There's every likelihood that the same methods were used in the archaic and classical periods, and they can be seen in action in this black figure, Oinochoi, depicting bound captives being led off by hoplites. And in this black figure, Lekythos, showing Heracles leading a couple of satyrs with their hands bound behind their backs and roped to each other. Such scenes played out around the Greek periphery through many centuries of antiquity. The slave trade was then a sprawling mechanism of social dislocation and relocation. In the first half of my talk, I want to sketch the scale and structure of this trade as the backdrop to strategies of othering and exclusion that are the focus of this research cycle spearheaded by Nino. I've chosen this theme in particular because it's the subject of a monograph that I'm working on at present, and I would like to share with you some of the source material that I'm dealing with and see what you make of it. Rather than present you with the full run of my source material, which would never fit into 45 minutes, I propose to stick to epigraphical evidence for the most part and to hop diachronically from one dossier of inscriptions to another. That is a whistle-stop tour of the most important source material for this subject. So the second theme of my talk today, of the latter part, is the cultural history of Greek interactions with non-Greeks, the ways in which slavery was justified and culturally domesticated, and how the thousands of foreigners trafficked to the Greek city-states each year were integrated into society as members of a specific legal category whose location at the bottom of the social hierarchy could be naturalized and justified. And the Peltas described by Xenophon as a case in point. He was almost certainly trafficked to Athens as a child, old enough to have acquired the language of his natal people, but too young to have gained a lasting sense of that people's ethnic identity, its name even, for which he had to inquire. Xenophon indeed provides no name for this man. He may have forgotten the Peltas name, or perhaps he never even asked for it in the first place. The Peltas certainly had at least one name, and was very probably renamed by his Athenian owner. The domain of naming is one where multiple identities can come into conflict and where strategies of othering and resistance to othering come into play. And rather than rehash familiar issues like Aristotle's theory of natural slavery, I wish in the latter part of this talk to pay particular attention to naming as a technique of othering, but also as a technique for domesticating slaves, if not slavery itself. And I'll pay attention to naming for a second reason, and that's because we now have an important study of how the slave trade shaped discourses of otherness in Chris Parmenter's Racialized Commodities, and though he does not discuss naming in detail. So what I'll speak about today is chosen in part so that I do not retread the ground covered in Chris's book or tread on his toes. The other thing that I wish to discuss, and which is relevant to the current cycle, is the evidence for Greeks enslaving other Greeks. So let us first consider the scale and structure of the Greek slave trade. The basic motive force behind this entire apparatus was demand for labor. And as Geoffroy de Saint Croix rightly pointed out over 40 years ago, in an economy such as that of ancient Greece, where levels of technological development were low by comparison to modernity, the chief way of raising one's living standard, of divesting oneself of the burdens of drudgery, be that producing and processing food or clothing, and also many of the challenges and toils of raising children, was to acquire extra familial labor, and that normally meant slaves. What is more, our evidence is unanimous in pointing to slaves as having been remarkably cheap in comparative historical terms, and therefore affordable by a wide swathe of the free population. Indeed, figures such as the everyman farmers of Aristophanes' plays were all slaveholders, usually owners of 2 or 3. And the inscribed building records of the Erechtheion in Athens from 414 BC show that this was no comic fantasy, for here working-class citizen and metic masons, laboring with their own hands, typically owned a couple of slaves who worked alongside them. And the same, I think, was true of other city-states. So this created a real groundswell of demand for slaves in the Greek world. But can we be more specific? We must, as a first order of business, answer 2 questions, even just approximately. First, how large was the total population of the Greek world? And secondly, what proportion of that population was composed of slaves? I should state at this juncture that my aim is not to produce pseudo-statistics, but the quality of our demographic evidence is far too poor for that. Rather, I want to calibrate our thinking to the correct order of magnitude. Are we talking about a trade that brought hundreds of individuals to the Greek cities each year, or thousands, or tens of thousands? This is a question I think we can get close to some answer to. So to make a very basic set of calculations, we need 3 things. First, an overall population estimate for the Greek world. Secondly, a range of possible percentages representing the enslaved component of that total. And thirdly, a rate at which the slave population had to be replaced due to death, manumission, flight, and so forth. For each of these, I'll choose the most conservative option that seems reasonable to me, so that I might not be accused of sensationalizing the scale of the Greek slave trade. So for the first of these elements, the late Mogens Hansen argued that the population of the Greek world in the 4th century BC, so that's at the high tide mark, as the archaeology shows, was in the region of 7.5 million, possibly as high as 10 million souls, slaves included. But Alain Bresson has recently advocated revising downwards Hansen's estimate closer to Julius Belloch's estimate, as revised recently by Corvisier and Soudet, of 5.5 to 5.6 million souls. So to err on the side of caution, I'll base the following computations on the lowest figure in that range, 5.5 million. For the second element, Hansen rightly points out that the enslaved component of the total population of the Greek world is usually a matter of educated guesswork, and I quote, "But the convention is quite arbitrary and the figure varies from 10% to 50% of the total population," end quote. In what follows, I'll calculate estimates at 10% intervals across this range, so as to provide a series of estimates from the highest plausible figure to the lowest. Finally, for the replacement rate, I will use Walter Scheidel's estimate of the social life expectancy of slaves in the Roman Empire, that is, the amount of time someone on average spent in slavery, as around 20 years. This is based on guesswork far more than any of the other variables I've just mentioned. But it has the virtue of being a conservative estimate in comparative historical terms, and therefore nudges any resultant calculation towards a lower figure than may indeed have truly been the case. At any rate, on the hypothesis of an average 20-year social life expectancy in slavery, Scheidel calculates that if there were 5 million slaves in the Roman Empire, which is his low estimate, 250,000 new slaves would have been needed each year. And if there were 8 million slaves, which is his high estimate, then 400,000 new slaves would be needed per annum. In other words, the slave population on his model naturally decreases at a rate of 5% per annum, requiring an equivalent number of new slaves in order to remain numerically stable. So the table here, which is also number 2A in your handout, here the left-hand column presents a series of possible percentages of our total population of 5.5 million that may plausibly have represented its enslaved component. The middle column presents a set of resultant figures for the overall slave population based on these assumed percentages, and the right-hand column presents numbers of new slaves needed annually to maintain these hypothetical slave populations, assuming a 5% annual decline. Okay. Can we trim this model down further to create a truly conservative range of estimates that will supply us with an absolute minimum plausible figure? Since we're trying, first of all, to generate a ballpark figure for the total number of slaves needed each year to keep the slave population up to strength, and only later we'll proceed to discuss the proportional split between reproduction and other supply mechanisms making up this figure, we may exclude from the outset those parts of the Greek world where we know that the slave population reproduced itself without relying at all on the slave trade, namely Laconia and Messenia, Crete, Thessaly, and Heraclea Pontica. And in doing so, we are again prejudicing our calculations towards lower conservative figures. We're assuming that Spartans and Perioikoi had no slaves other than helots, that Cretan slave systems did not rely at all on piracy to acquire new slaves, and that the Penestae and Mariandinoi, Thessaly and Heraclea respectively, represent the whole of the Thessalian and Heracleid slave systems, rather than just the holdings of the aristocracy. Each of these a questionable proposition. So I justify this choice here only because, again, it provides a lower conservative estimate. So by using the regional population figures of Corvisier and Sudé, we can deduct 990,000 individuals from regions where Helotic-style systems existed from the overall 5.5 million, meaning that we're left with 4.5 million individuals. And on that basis, the calculations look more like this. This is handout 2B. So to sum up so far then, if we assume a total population of the classical Greek world of around 5.5 million souls, and then secondly, by excluding those areas with Helotic populations, bring the total down to 4.5 million souls. Thirdly, assume that only 10% of this population was composed of slaves. And fourthly, assume that the social life expectancy was quite high at 20 years. And the rock bottom minimum number of new slaves needed per annum would be 22,550. And if we were to raise the percentage of the total population made up by slaves to the 30 to 40% argued by Alain Bresson for Attica, for instance, and something like 67,000 to 90,000 new slaves would have been needed per annum in 4th century Greece. Much can be done to refine the input variables and methodology for such calculations. So it's a very rough back of the envelope, a preliminary sketch. It's nothing like the kind of sophisticated work done by Miles Lavin. But even at this low resolution and kind of preliminary stage, the scale of the problem comes into better focus. This still leaves us with the task of thinking about how much this demand was met by natural reproduction versus other strategies such as fed into the slave trade. That's a problem I'll postpone for a few minutes. But is this all just completely conjectural? Well, we do have one piece of evidence that acts as a check on the plausibility of what I've just mentioned, and that's Xenophon's Poroi. Writing after the end of the Social War in 355, which had left Athens's finances in a ruinous state, Xenophon advises that the Athenians repair their fortunes by investing in a publicly owned workforce of slave silver miners, making an initial purchase of 1,200 individuals and reinvesting the profits from their annual labor in buying more slaves so that within 5 or 6 years, the workforce would reach a total of 6,000. Further expansion would bring this figure up to a total of 10,000. This is Poroi 423. One reason for the staggered purchase spread over several years is that the upfront cost would be much smaller than buying the whole workforce at once, which makes sense in terms of Athens's limited finances when the pamphlet was written. But at Poroi 436, Xenophon points out another advantage. Acquiring the whole workforce at once would mean buying poorer quality slaves at inflated prices. And this presupposes that Xenophon thought that such a mass purchase would be hypothetically possible. Assuming that Xenophon had a fair grasp of the scale and operation of the slave trade in his own day, and he is, after all, one of our best informants on slavery in classical Greece, was himself exceptionally well-traveled and connected and informed. We may conclude that a one-off purchase of 6 or perhaps even 10,000 slaves was just about possible, but would cause so sharp a spike in demand that prices would shoot up alarmingly. Yet the trade operated on sufficiently large a scale that Xenophon could envisage that his staggered purchasing plan would still allow for slaves to be bought at under 200 drachmas each. So if you do the sums of it, for this, it comes out 180 to 190 drachmas each as the working assumption. So in other words, the demand for an extra 1,000 or so slaves per annum would not have much an effect on the market value of the slave. So a figure of several tens of thousands of slaves being imported annually into the Greek world in the mid-4th century BC is therefore plausible and marries up with the ranges calculated earlier, though not with our rock bottom figure of just over 22,000, since such a supply would fill every vacancy and more through trade alone. And the likely problem here is that the idea that only 10% of the population was made up of slaves is too low. At this juncture, I want to turn to some of our evidence for the slave population itself and its geographical origins. Unfortunately, there's hardly any evidence from the Archaic period, just occasional snippets, such as this vase signed by its painter, Lydos, that is the Lydian, with the remark that he was a slave, or even more tenuously, this late Archaic graffito carved on a rock near Vouliagmeni to the south of Athens by Libus, a shepherd. This uses an odd term for shepherd, but it's a shepherd. An African slave, perhaps. In a recent article, Cameron Pearson, so these have been collected by Merle Langdon. He's found 1,000 or so. Most of them aren't published. And here's, on the left-hand side, a preliminary publication by Langdon. And in this other article by Cameron Pearson, he's reported that other such names from the still to be published total dossier of late Archaic Attic rupestral graffiti found by Langdon. Pearson plausibly argues that these names were borne by slaves. So they include Thrax, or a Thracian man, Babylon, Ludos, Lydian, just like our vase painter from a moment ago, and Sikelides, a Sicilian, perhaps. But this evidence is meager and uncertain. For the classical period, the evidence is much better. For several epigraphical dossiers, shed some fleeting light on the problem. No doubt the most famous is the so-called Attic Stelae, the fragmentary remains of the Politae records that recorded the auctioning off the property of the Hermocopodi. So these are the people who vandalized the Herms and supposedly parodied the mysteries on the advent of the Athenian armada departing for Sicily. So many of them convicted, the property seized by the Athenian state, auctioned off, and what we have are the fragmentary remains of those auction records. So among the long fragmentary lists of pots and pans and textiles and household furniture, we find some 45 slaves auctioned off. So this is also on handout item 3. And unlike the archaic graffiti, we know for sure that we're dealing with slaves here and have in almost all cases explicit statements of ethnic origin rather than just suggestive names. So this is a fragment of this dossier edited by the original David Lewis, original David M. Lewis, as part of IG1 cubed 421. Of the 45 slaves in the whole dossier, it goes 421 to 430. And we have either solid or reasonable information about the origins of 35 of them. And here, this is also in your handout. Several striking features of this dossier might be noted. First, almost all of these are non-Greeks. And among the various origins, Thracians are the most prominent here, with 10 individuals, and Carians next, here with 7 individuals. There are only 2 Greeks, and these from fairly backwater areas. Only 3 individuals were born into slavery from this dossier. The rest were imported to Athens. Of course, we must be wary of treating this small sample as if it were a representative sample of the whole Athenian slave population, but even impressionistically, the low numbers of Greeks and homeborn slaves are remarkable. A second important document is the naval list IG1 cubed 1032, dating to around the same time, maybe a decade later or so. The inscription, or the fragmentary remains of it at least, so you can see the fragments here and the conjectured original layout of the stone. Were studied in detail by Donald Lang, who showed that it originally listed the crews of around 8 triremes. Exactly what the inscription commemorates is debated, but it seems not to be a casualty list. At any rate, it mentions almost 150 slaves and rowers, listing them under the title therapontes, one of the more polite terms for slaves, and with their owners' names in the genitive case. Almost a third of these bear ethnic or foreign names suggestive of their origins. Here, this is also in the handout. There are several downsides to this dossier. First is, unlike the Attic stelae, it gives us once more suggestive ethnic and foreign names rather than explicit statements of origin, something that I'll return to later. Furthermore, it neither allows us to work out the ratio of non-Greeks to Greeks, nor provides any clues to homeborn slaves, so that those two categories are essentially dissolved into the Greek names there and are masked by them. And finally, it's wholly composed of men, so it gives us nothing to go by in terms of the kind of sex ratios in Athenian slavery. Beyond Athens, we have very little similar material from the classical period. There's a dedication from Skyros mentioning names that are suggestive of slaves of foreign origins. An inscription from Thasos mentioning a shepherd bearing the Anatolian name Manis, Christos tois despotais, or useful to his masters. And a set of lists from Chios full of Anatolian names that seem to be, also Louis Robert argued, a state manumission of slaves who had served the Chians in war, again, all male. The Hellenistic period contains the richest material for studying the slave trade, and although there are random scraps of evidence from many places, I wish to discuss 3 epigraphic dossiers and 1 funerary stele as particularly important. First, the sale manumissions of West Locris. Secondly, the sale manumissions of Delphi. Third, Rhodian epigraphy, mainly funerary. And fourthly, an important funerary stele from Rhenia in the Cyclades. So manumission via sale to the god is first attested in West Locris in the late 3rd century BC. Here, this is if you turn to handout number 5 as the material. Though most of our texts, like this one, date to the 2nd century BC. We can look forward in the near future to a new IG volume by Denis Rousset, with additions and refinements to Klaffenbach's IG volume from the 1960s, but I'll rely on Klaffenbach for now. Here's a particularly nice example of the genre. So when Eumaeus, son of Pythodorus, was secretary to the Thearoi in the month of Homoloios, Dionysius, son of Eusthenes, sold to Dionysus in Naupactos a male slave whose name is Eutychidas, Galatian by race, Togenos Galatan, and a female whose name is Aphrodisia, Thracian by race, Togenos Thrasan, and a little girl named Sostrata, homeborn, Togenos Oikogenes. These all were sold for 35 silver minae, and then it goes on to list witnesses and so on and so forth. What's particularly valuable is that for some reason or other, the legal formula of the West Locrian manumissions includes as pretty much standard a statement of the origin of the freed person, or as in this case, persons, in a genos clause, like the genos clauses you can see here. Or we can see in this case a family of mixed origins, a Galatian father, a Thracian mother, and a mixed ethnicity child, jointly manumitted for the eye-watering sum of 35 minas. I've included on the handout a summary of what we know of slave origins from this dossier. More slaves were homeborn than bought, with 47 of the former and 33 of the latter. A partial inversion in the other direction from what we saw in the Attic stelae. And among the bought slaves, 10 came from Greece, 5 from Anatolia, 6 from the Balkans in the north, and 12 from the Near East. The West Locrian manumissions, there's over 100 of these in total, are however dwarfed by the Delphic manumissions. Many of them inscribed in on the polygonal retaining wall of the Temple of Apollo, the sanctuary at Delphi. These are very easy to miss if you go here as a tourist, but if you get your nose right up against the wall, you can see they're written very small, and there's over 1,000 of them, 1,341 in the new edition, magisterial new edition by Dominique Moulier, CID 5. 2 volumes already in print, and the 3rd volume, which contains appendices and discussion, due next year, hopefully. So this is his life work, and I think he should get another medal added to his collection here for performing this precious service to scholarship on ancient slavery. So these documents date from between 201 BC and AD 100, and most of them are clustered in the 2nd century BC. As I said, there's 1,341 documents in Moulier's CID 5. I'm currently working through these. I'm at about number 750. So it's slow going, but I'll get there in the end. However, courtesy of some notes from Professor Moulier, I can show you a corrected version of an earlier count that I published in 2017, showing the spread of attested origins minus the homeborn slaves here. This is also on your handout. As you can see, we have in total 230 cases of reported origin for purchased slaves. 63, or just over 27% of this total, were Greeks. 38, or 17%, came from the Balkans. 18 from the Black Sea. 37 from Anatolia, so about the same as the number from the Balkans. And 61, so just under 27%, from the Near East. Small numbers came from Africa and Italy. I wish to draw your attention to several groups in particular. First, we still have, as before, quite a few Thracians, but there are now even more Syrians than we saw in the classical period. And if you look across the various clusters of evidence that we have, Syrians are nearly always the best represented group. I think it's something to do with the 6 Syrian wars fought from the 3rd into the 2nd century BC in that area, and then also the Maccabean wars, and the general fact that that's a kind of tectonic fault zone between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, where not just wars occurred, but all sorts of instability that pushed people into slavery. I'll have to develop that elsewhere anyhow. Secondly, we have some newcomers, some substitutions. So the Sarmatians migrated into the area of the northern Black Sea, previously occupied by people the Greeks called Scythians, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. So in our Hellenistic epigraphical evidence, we almost never find Scythians, but we find Sarmatians. They seem to have kind of knocked them out and taken their place, and then produced slaves for the Greek cities in their lieu. Secondly, a large group of Celtic peoples known to the Greeks as Galatians crossed into Asia Minor in the early 270s BC, settling in parts of what had been previously called Phrygia. We find this group as a slave source in subsequent evidence, such as in the Delphic manumissions. This map shows the remarkably diverse origins of slaves manumitted at Delphi, with the bigger blobs here standing for regions that are better represented, and smaller blobs for less well-represented regions. The Delphians and other Central Greeks who manumitted at the sanctuary, so there's also many people come from Phocis, West Locris, Doris, Aetolia, Central Greek regions come to Delphi to manumit. So it's not just representing the Delphic population, but a wider kind of Central Greek tendency. We're drawing on people from very far-flung regions to the north and to the east. Bastarnians from the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, you can see at the top in the middle here. Sarmatians and Maeotians from the northern reaches of the Black Sea. Armenians from south of the Lesser Caucasus. Arabs from the desert, and even Iranians off the edge of this map. As for homeborn versus purchased slaves, the latter predominate in the first 50 years of the manumissions. So there's more bought slaves than homeborn, from 201 down to about 150. But after 150, the proportions reverse, and homeborn slaves become the most numerically predominant, just like in the West Locrian manumissions, which are less precisely dated. These manumissions can be compared to the Rhodian epigraphic record, and here I should say that I rely on much help and encouragement from my friend Christian Thomsen, the National Museum of Denmark, formerly University of Copenhagen, with whom I am working on an article on slavery and the slave trade in Hellenistic roads, long Hellenistic period roads going into the imperial period, basically Angelos Haniotis' Hellenistic period. Most of our evidence comes from gravestones, okay, like that of Obastis here. Your handout provides a breakdown of the ethnic groups in the Rhodian documents based on Boyksen's recent book on foreigners at Rhodes. And you can see that in this commercial hub, imported slaves dwarf the number of homeborn or engine slaves. These are the ones at the very end down here. Reminiscent of what we saw in the Attic stelae, there is, unsurprisingly, given Rhodes' location, a particular predominance of Anatolians. And you can see here and on the handout several typical examples of the genre. And in Rhodes' particular epigraphic culture, such cases usually denote slaves. The question is, however, contested, and Christian and I will provide arguments in favor of the traditional view that these are mainly slaves, but not totally. I mean, another feature of the genre is that if you were a Greek enslaved at Rhodes and manumitted and set up a funerary stele, the formula you'd use would completely disguise that fact, so we can't see Greeks at all. That's one of the weaknesses of the Rhodian dossier. Though when you look at Delphi, look at West Locris and other places, there's a lot of Greeks there. Finally, we could take into account a grave stele from Rhenia, the island necropolis of the Delians. This is handout number 8 from the 2nd century BC. And I believe that this inscription is currently located in the Roma mansion, the Roma collection in Zakynthos. So if anyone happens to be there on holiday and wants to take a photo of this inscription there, because there's no photo in print to my knowledge, and also has a ruler for scale, I'd be very happy, and we'll owe you several drinks if you send it to me. Anyhow, it's this document's a list of the names and origins of 22 individuals described as belonging to a certain protarchos. And what's particularly interesting here is that the origins are mostly specific toponyms rather than ethnica or broader regions. So here I've put them onto a map. Note once more that in the commercial hub of Delos, we see a preponderance of foreign purchased slaves over the just one possible homeborn case, which is the Apollonia, the daughter of this Cyrenian. These 22 individuals would appear to have perished together, hence the joint burial or perhaps a joint cenotaph. I think the studio was actually kind of carted off somewhere before it could be properly excavated with its archaeological context and to see who was in the ground, if anyone. Anyway, they seem to have perished in some manner of accident, and people have speculated maybe it was a fire or something like that. Who knows? A few points about the evidence that we've looked at so far. And first, there are some basic continuities over time, although we find shifts both due to actual historical changes and the appearance of Sarmatians and substitution of them for Scythians is one example. Galatians are another. The increase in Syrians is a third example. And then also variations from dossier to dossier based on the fact that they're quite fairly small in terms of what would satisfy a statistician. So can't treat them as completely representative. There's going to be some inaccuracy in sampling there. Nonetheless, the main catchment zones upon which the Greek slave systems depended were Thrace and the Balkans, the Black Sea region, Anatolia, which is also partly part of the Black Sea region, and Syria, and so a few other places too, but those are the main areas. Strikingly, there's very little evidence for the import of slaves from the Western Mediterranean to Aegean Greece, despite the Greeks having many cities in Italy and Sicily, some even in France and Spain, and excellent trade connections to the West. The reason, in my opinion, is that the slave systems of Rome and Carthage were probably already exerting sufficient commercial gravity to capture the slave supplies of the whole Western Mediterranean basin. Though if we had better epigraphical evidence from the Greek towns of Italy and Sicily, we might find them sharing in Western Mediterranean supplies too. So much for the main clusters of evidence for the Greek slave trade going down into the imperial period, certainly for Delphi and Rhodes at least. What I now want to look at are questions of ethnicity, race, identity, all part of the discourses of otherness alluded to in my title. I want to look in particular at names and naming as part of this, and laterally at the enslavement of Greeks by other Greeks. First, a basic question on the reliability of ethnic or foreign names for working white slaves' true origins. And we can turn here to a classic statement by an ancient author, Strabo. He says that the Getae, the people living in the area, reaching eastwards to the Black Sea, while the Dacians live in the area towards Germany and the sources of the Danube. I think that in ancient times they were called Dai, and it was because of them that the names Geta and Getas and Daos were common for slaves among the Athenians. At least this is a more likely explanation than that they were named after the Scythian tribe called the Dai, since they live far away in Hyrcania, so to the south of the Caspian Sea, basically. And it is most unlikely that any slaves were ever brought to Attica from there. In fact, the Athenians would either name their slaves up to the area from which they were imported, or give them the same names as their tribes, such as Lydos or Syros, so for Lydians and Syrians, or give them names which were common in those countries, like Manis or Midas for a Phrygian, or Tibios for a Paphlagonian. I think Strabo's read a lot of New Comedy. If you ask Bianca, you see that half the slaves in New Comedy are called Getas, and the other half of the male ones are called Daos. But there might be exceptions. But that's very much the common picture there. Now, it's a common place to point out that such names are neither proof of origins or of slave status. So we find a random person called Manis. We don't know that person's a slave. We also don't know for sure that person's a Phrygian. One example of the cautious argument that's often given is that there's an early classical tyrant from Sicily called Scythes, probably due to a kind of Scythian, named after some sort of Scythian guest friendship connection. And that point's all and well, and I completely accept it, but I'm interested in cases where we know for a fact that the people we're dealing with are slaves. We know from other evidence that they held that status. Such people were unlikely to be named after Scythian guest friends, okay? I've argued in previous publications that we can actually test this by looking at those rare cases of individuals bearing such names in some of the dossiers of epigraphical evidence that we looked at earlier, such as the West Locrian and Delphic manumissions. And here we can have an ethnic or foreign name for a manumitted individual, plus an emphatic separate statement of ethnic origins in a genos clause like the ones we saw earlier. And then we can just count up and check how often the ethnic or foreign name matches or mismatches with the emphatic statement of origins in the genos clause. My conclusion was that in about 8 out of 10 instances, the ethnic or foreign name is a good fit for the declared ethnic origins of its bearer. This has implications for how we make use of such names when we have names alone to go by as an indication of origin, such as in the naval dossier that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, in even more marginal cases, such as the late archaic graffiti from near Vuliagmeni that we saw much earlier. In brief, such names become particularly useful when we have relatively large numbers of individuals in our sample, such as in that naval dossier. For if we get 8 hits and two misses out of 10, that still gives us a reasonable sense of which ethnic groups are particularly prominent, and that tells us something about the structure of the slave trade. But when we're dealing with just isolated cases and individuals, the best that we can conclude from names is a maybe, and a very maybe if we don't know that they're slaves for other reasons. But when we look at the full run of slaves' names, and I say slaves' names rather than slave names because there wasn't a distinct genre of the latter, So we look at the full run of those from this or that region. Rather surprising pattern emerges. So in classical Attica, as Costas Philosopoulos is shown in this rather good article, such ethnic and foreign names for slaves are actually not numerically preponderant in classical Athens. Therefore, the common argument made in scholarship, or at least scholarship up to that point, that such names were a standard way of Greeks othering their slaves, is not borne out by most of the evidence. And I've argued that the same pattern holds even more strongly when we go into the Hellenistic period and look at the Delphic manumissions. So here, even when we know for sure that we're dealing with non-Greeks because we've got genos clauses, they almost always bear a standard Greek name. And having one of these ethnic or foreign names of the sort that Strabo mentions actually really, really rare. There's, I think, fewer than 10, maybe, well, definitely fewer than 20 in the whole Delphic corpus. So explaining this has left me scratching my head for some time. I'd initially supposed that the scholarship on othering, particularly the kind of structuralist-inspired self and other work that was popular during the 1990s, especially in France and the Anglosphere, had maybe just exaggerated the prevalence of name-based othering because of its particular scholarly preoccupations. Maybe that's correct. But it still seems rather remarkable that when confronted with a newly purchased Syrian or Thracian or Sarmatian, most Greek owners chose not to emphasize their foreignness and rename them with mostly quite standard Greek names. As this research cycle has been dedicated to showing, the ancients had a certain, and the medievals, had a certain amount of mental work to do to make slavery palatable and to appear natural and just. And with Aristotle's outsized influence on modern perceptions of what this mental work might look like, by his equation of non-Greeks with natural slaves, the domain of naming would seem to present an easy opportunity for Greek slaveholders to underscore foreign slaves' inferiority, thereby provide some solace that they were justly enslaving barbarians who are naturally well fitted for this particular role. Why then did the majority of owners, as the epigraphy shows, pass up on this opportunity? Another way of looking at this problem is in terms of domestication or attempted domestication, let's say, a term here used by Professor Luragi and his team in relation to slavery. And here I think that a possible explanation might be ventured if we apply that individually to slaveholders and their purchases. Greek slave owners faced with foreign slaves ripped from their native milieu and trafficked to Greece had an incentive to erase, or at least to try to erase, past identities, to domesticate foreign slaves into a Greek environment. This, of course, meant learning Greek for the victim or target of this process, for those who already didn't know it. But a new name, more often than not a Greek name, emphasized a new start in a new world, a start at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, but one where at least the possibility of manumission and limited integration as a free person come metoikos or katoikos was held out as a possible life goal. If this explanation has any mileage, then we might have to view naming only part as a discourse, as to do with a discourse of othering, and more as a tool of attempted cultural erasure and domestication. Unsurprisingly, this strategy seems often to have failed, and we can see both the owner's perspective, that is what they wanted to achieve with naming, and the slave's perspective, usually not playing ball, by looking at a wide range of epigraphical genres as we've done. So if we look again at that naval dossier, for instance, what's striking to me is the sheer uniformity and repetition of the ethnic and foreign names. So here, everyone that we suspect of being Assyrian is called Syros. Okay, almost everyone we suspect of being Phrygian was called Manis. Almost everyone we suspect of being Thracian is called Thrax. This fits very well with the kind of Strabo view that I showed you a moment ago. So the extensive use of stereotypical ethnic and foreign names as an othering strategy. But if we look at funerary epigraphy, things look a little bit different. So I should say this is an official document of the Athenian state. That's where it's coming from. It's reflecting the the priorities of the demos, okay, the slaveholding classes. If we look at funerary epigraphy, things look a little bit different. So if we take, for instance, the now rather famous grave stele of Atotas the Minor, who the last 20 years has popped up in a lot of publications, and rightly so. He's here given a faux Paphlagonian Homeric lineage. I'm assuming it's, sorry, Atotas, if it's actually his true lineage, but I'm assuming it's a faux Paphlagonian Homeric lineage. And leaving aside for now the question of whether this document projects Atotas's own identity or the kind of identity a fond and culturally literate owner or former owner thought that he should have put on his grave stele, the name at least is an odd one. This is not a stereotypical name like Manis or Midas, but the sort of name we find in Anatolian inscriptions, in Augustas Kleinasiatischen Personennamen. Okay. We look at the full set of suspected slaves from Lorient, assembled by Siegfried Laufer. We can strike a contrast with the naval dossier. So there are, of course, a few stereotypical names here: Manis, Syros, Thrax, but it's balanced out by a number of far rarer foreign names. And these documents are, of course, mainly tombstones. Okay, so they're not official documents; they're private documents, and they're coming from the person who's being commemorated or the person's family, usually. The Hellenistic Rhodian funerary epigraphy shows something similar, where mixed in with the Greek names for foreign slaves are a wide variety of far rarer non-Greek names. And in these cases, the obvious explanation is that these deceased individuals had retained their natal identities and original names. And even if they had to go along with an imposed name during their time in slavery, or during the time at least they were under the eye of their owner, they seem to have retained their natal names, their real names, their true names, and had those inscribed in their tombstones. And that's why we get different patterns in that different kind of epigraphy. In some rare cases, we can actually find evidence for slaves with multiple names. On the one hand, this could reflect resistance. Take, for instance, a runaway notice from Ptolemaic Egypt mentioning a slave named Philonides, but who seems also to have gone by the name Beltinuris, or so the notice claims. This is a Hellenized form of a Babylonian Akkadian name, Beltinuri, my lady is my light. So clearly we have a Babylonian origin slave here who refused both to put up with the Greek name imposed on him and with slavery in general, hence him running away. But there's a darker alternative. And this is something known from many slave societies and slave systems, and that is life courses that involve multiple resales for particular individuals. And here there was at each juncture, at each resale, an incentive for the new owner to make that person have a fresh start by imposing a new name. So take, for example, we have a manumission from Dodona whose recipient, Agathoclea, we are told had formerly been called Euporia. And we can't even be sure if Euporia was her natal name, so she might have had another name before that. So some slaves at least might, at numerous points in their lives, face an effort from new owners to impose a new identity on them by changing their name, multiple attempts at erasure. I want to finish by discussing one more thing, the phenomenon of Greeks enslaving other Greeks. So in Aristotle's view, Greeks did not make for natural slaves. And we know from various 4th century writers, Plato, Isocrates, but also Demosthenes in his discussion of the Elanthian girl and his speech on the false embassy. Mirko mentioned that in his seminar on Tuesday, that the idea of Greeks enslaving other Greeks could prove culturally uncomfortable. This is something that in his work on the Messenians, Nino Luragi has dealt with extensively. The epigraphical evidence that I've canvassed today provides some solid purchase on the scale of this phenomenon. And we might look at the Delphian evidence in particular again here. There's a lot of Greeks here. Just over a quarter of the purchased slaves later manumitted at Delphi were Greeks. That's not even counting the couple of Cypriots as well. So it's actually more than 60. I think it's 65. Where are my Cypriots? Yes, this should be 65. So it's probably closer to 30, getting on towards 30% there. I've a good bit of work to do with comparing the manumission dates of these individuals with the dates of Noah Moore's, for example, figuring in, of course, the social life expectancy in slavery pre-manumission. But what's striking is how most of these Greeks came from this kind of belt of central and northern Greece, and often from fairly backwater places. And indeed, I had to look up a number of the polis of origin stated here in Hansen and Nielsen to find out exactly where they were. Like, good for you if you know where all of those places are. You're a better Greek historian than me already. In a few cases, we find Greeks being held as slaves in their natal polis itself. Thus, we find slaves are identified as Amphissen, so not as homeborn from Amphissa, but actually as Amphissen, being held in slavery by another Amphissen and then eventually manumitted. The odd Delphian being held in slavery in Delphi too. Such cases contradict the common assumption that the Greek cities all followed or mostly followed the Solonian principle of forbidding the enslavement of their own citizenry. So to conclude then, I hope that this overview of our main evidence for the ancient Greek slave trade has provided some food for thought and some material for discussion on the theme of the current cycle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, so I'll try and make two questions.
Okay.
So just on this last point, something I often wonder is what happens to an oikogenes? Say the homeborn slave owned by an Aetolian, and then someone from Delphi purchases that person. Do they remain oikogenes? Do you then describe them as Aetolos? I'm just wondering if that.
I don't want to make like a really hard and fast law for this. There, as you know well, there's some variation. I mean, this is going over several centuries, so it's not the same accountant writing or the same scribe writing out the formula each time. And even though it stays fairly stable over time, you expect a certain amount of irregularity. And I think normally and in some cases you definitely do. It says oikogenes ex polis, so the fact of that person's origins get passed along and remembered. No, exactly. So that's what I expect in most cases, but yeah, it certainly wouldn't want to make it a hard and fast rule. And you had a second question?
Second part of that.
Second part of the first question.
In terms of, I guess if you have Togenos, if it's a Togenos Delphos, I guess is it necessarily the case that they were a citizen? Or that was kind of I don't know, because you could be born in Delphi without.
Yeah, I would have thought you get something like Togenos X and then the polis name. So rather than giving just straight into the polis name, which would imply citizenship to me. Sometimes there's mentions of, I think it's katoikoi in Delphi as the kind of metic equivalent, and but that's what I would expect.
One people it's just like from the
someone from the countryside. Yeah. So yeah, it's the most precise evidence that we've got, and it's still not as precise as we'd like. So you got a second question? Yeah, sure.
I think it's not publicly kind of posted in online.
Yeah.
And you can explain the gender, the sex ratio.
Yeah.
I wondered if, first of all, what you think of that argument, and second of all, if there's anything in that, you can also could in some sense explain the kind of wickedness, the lack of wickedness.
Yeah, okay. So for those that don't know, so Peter's argument is that I've not, if you don't know the Greek, then I've not indicated this very well in the handout, but basically most of the people in the Attic stela are male. Okay, and this is an unusual sex ratio. And Peter's argument is essentially that when the people who vandalized the Herms, who owned these slaves and then had them confiscated, whenever earlier on in time, when those people got married, the wives would bring as dowry or trousseau female handmaidens with them, and therefore that would have resulted in the households of a more even gender balance. But because it's the husband's property that's being confiscated and not the wives, we see a preponderance of males. I kind of like the idea, but I'm a bit reluctant to scale it up. Like I mentioned, this is a very small sample for dealing with a very large population, and that question of kind of representativeness gives me a bit of pause before wanting to kind of extrapolate about sex ratios. And I'd rather look at all the other things from classical Athens to kind of read against that until I'm more sure. So I'm not entirely sure of that. That said, I mean, it does seem to be the case that when we get evidence from big coastal commercial polis, you find a lot more foreign slaves than homeborn ones. There's another argument about, as we go further down in time, as the Mediterranean becomes more economically integrated, essentially all the supplies that the Greeks are drawing on get tapped into by Italian merchants, which raises demand relative to steady supply, pushes the prices up, and therefore nudges slave owners towards relying more on reproduction instead of paying a higher price for people. I like that idea too, but I need to check. I need to do more thinking before I fully commit to it. So yeah, I like Peter's argument. I think it's very interesting, but as for scaling it up, I'm not too sure. And there's also presumably like one of the things when the Attic Stela were discovered and published was, oh, these households are quite austere. There's lots of pots and pans and troughs and things like that, but where's all the rich furnishings and so on? And I think basically these people took all the best stuff and got rid of it before the Athenian state could send magistrates to confiscate things. So what we've not got is like a very austere upper class, but we've just got all the mostly the heavy immovable stuff, and they got some of the slaves that belong to them too. Like, good question.
You have, I think our institution say, these guys on this guy, from like 5 generations ago. And they still say, that's it.
Yeah.
They're very kind of keen on keeping that stuff going. Whereas, like, with the other organisms getting here, like, how long does kind of original ethnicity last? Because they seem to disappear. Like,
yeah, I mean, you can see that in that West Lochran example I put up with here. No, that's the Rhodian one. Let me go back a couple more slides. This one. So we've got a Thracian who's given a Greek name, a Galatian, okay, who's given a Greek name, and then they have a child who's given a Greek name and is Oikogenes. So they're just that detail's lost. And I know Matthew's doing work on this issue of integration. After do you want to actually keep alive this memory, or do you want to integrate as quickly as possible and hope people forget that you have a yeah.
I mean, in the case of the manumissions, they are, because they're complex of sale, the key distinction really that they are interested in putting is whether they're organic, whether they're foreign.
Yeah.
That's the kind of main fact. So I guess in this sense, the ethnicity of assuming the soft structure in this case is the child.
Yeah, which I think
which also is implied by the fact that they pay
giant fee.
Huge premium to bring together. The normal president.
Yeah. It's a rip-off. Yeah. Absolutely.
but I think the humor is it's a very different context. If you so again. Thank you so much. Very informative. I have a question again about this seeming friction between enslaved people who were given Greek names by their owners, by and I'm just thinking out loud here, I don't really much consideration. But do you think in classical Athens, at least, there was less of a premium attached to advertising the fact that your slave came from far away? In the Roman world, there was social reasons why it would be good to communicate that you owned a slave from an exotic place. But perhaps in the Greek context, was there reasons for privileging domestication over advertising for them?
I'd be inclined to agree with you with a few qualifications. So, I mean, I don't want to disagree too much with Chris on his book, but there are some cases. So we've got one in Theophrastus's characters where the guy of petty ambition, microphilotemia, he's doing all these things to get attention. One of them is to procure a black African slave, and this is, you know, obviously someone who was very expensive and rare, and this is a way of kind of showing off. As for whether there's a really strong kind of association between certain groups are good at certain things, I was mentioning to you earlier, a lot of the examples, we don't have many examples, and most of them actually cut against that thesis. So we've got, for example, Sosias, the Thracian mine manager, bought by Nicias, the general. And so if you go for the stereotype, Thracians are really stupid and they should all be essentially bouncers or something like that, or kind of hired muscle. This guy's doing an incredibly skilled managerial role. Or there's a guy, Manis, who's one of the other grave stelae we've got from the classical period. And so it's got an Anatolian name. He's coming from the east, should be very clever, maybe work as a banker. He's a really good woodcutter, according to his own testimony, or the testimony put on his gravestone at least. So the evidence is so thin as I wouldn't want to push it too far. But I think there's definitely something of that going on. But I don't think it's maybe as strong as in the Roman case.
Looking at the one gets the sense that there are different levels, although it may be probably different levels of identification of enslaved people. Some are just affiliation, male or female. Some have a profession which presumably has an impact on the products. The trapezopoulos, the one who stables, it's not both. I wonder if there's anything that we have these different levels of identity. Some of the name, something not. Some of the name and profession. There's nobody who is professional.
Yeah. I think mainly this is the fact that these auctions ran over multiple days and were not all done at once, and presumably there was different kind of abilities help, like writing down the details. Some people were better at note taking than others, is what my suspicion is. So in 421, you just get apart from this Pisistratus, the Carian child, in line 9, mostly it's just Thracian woman, Thracian woman, Thracian man, Syrian, Carian, Illyrian, Hilarion, etc. The later ones, when you get the occupation, that definitely, I think, contributes to the price. So that chap at 422, line 70, 78, the Carian goldsmith, Botanius. He's the most valuable one because we've also got the prices for a lot of these. And I didn't include them in the handout, but he goes for 360 drachmas. That's the highest price attested in the stelae. The cheapest one is for 72 drachmas. For, if you look on the left hand side, 421, line 46, the little Carian infant. This is 72 drachmas. So very young, has no skill set yet. It's maybe more of a liability than but it can be trained up to be a valuable return. It hasn't got there yet. It's a much lower market price. There's so many variables that can kind of influence the price. I think in the American case, there's a historian who counted over 30 different variables that influence the market price. Age and skills being very important among them.
Yeah, I think the ones we cannot really see that the preparation of USA is called up sooner.
Yeah.
You can have informed guesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, so yeah. No. She's someone's little luxury. Not very nice.
There's not much nice about it.
No. It's I take a strong stomach for studying of this. Yeah, carry-on's the most. No, I don't think so, because carry-ons often use of adult male characters, for example. The lexicographers try to come up with like weird explanations for this. Like what was one I've seen that the carry-ons were all short, something like that, and that's why they get a diminutive form. I don't know. If it's anything like modern Greeks, they like making everything a diminutive. So or lots of things are diminutive. Practically everything's got aki on it or something like that, or uli or something like that among modern Greeks. So I really don't have a good explanation for that, but I don't think it's to do with age. Yeah, it's done pretty inconsistently with the Greek stuff. I mean, you can also, you can use diminutives also though for affection, like Greeks nowadays do, or the Scots and Irish. If they say something's we, it normally isn't literally meaning it's small. It's just an affectionate we affectation.
Also on the but there are really imputed evidence data that are attached to these to some of these people. Pseudos really make something to the Greeks. If you say to the Western Mediterranean and doubt it, it's very much to do that. Carians, perhaps we are dealing with something where both the Greeks and the Carians would understand what it meant. The moment you go to the Black Sea again, I have massive doubts. If you ask any of these enslaved speakers, they will say
yeah, of course.
Is there like a mental geography of enslavement behind this? More than the actual problem. I mean, I'm not doubting that the pseudos, there was a high level of correlation with Europe being trafficked from the Eastern Mediterranean. But I wonder whether what we see here might not be more an expression of the Athenians' mental geography of enslavement.
I wonder how much too it links up to language. Like, are they calling Syros Aramaic speakers? Something like that. And then I'm not saying that the Athenians spoke Arabic or anything like that, but it's certainly the case. I mean, personally for me at least, that I can not know much about a language at all, but still pick it out from a different one. I don't speak any Slavic languages, but I know the sound of Russian, and I probably would mix it up with Ukrainian and maybe some other Slavic languages, but I could tell it apart from Mandarin or French. Well, not a French, that's not a problem. Or distinguish between Mandarin and Japanese. So it might just be the ear. And certainly the old oligarch says this about the Athenians, that essentially they're attuned to many, many different languages, which is not to say they actually really knew them. I wonder what your thoughts were on that case of nonsense inscriptions that Adrian Meyer and some linguists working on the Caucasus had published a few years back. Do you buy into that?
I think it's still on the level of suggestive rather than persuasive, because the number of supporting assumptions that we need to make to those inscriptions.
Yeah.
Some sort of rather than
the level of granularity though with if we look at the Delphic ones, look at the Anatolia. We've got okay, you've got Lydians and Mycenaeans, Bithynians, and so on, but there's also Tibarenians. I mean, how many people have heard of these guys? And they're kind of if you think of the north coast of Turkey, they're kind of in the middle there, somewhere to the west of where the Macrones are. That's a pretty niche one, and I'm wonder about some of the Italian ones as well. I mean, maybe there's one guy who's just an Italian, okay, but they also have Samnites and Bruttians and so on here. There's a surprising level of granularity if it were just a case of these people are from over here roughly, and these people are from over there roughly. And it would be convenient for me if these were laser accurate, because it would be able to let me write a more precise history of the slave trade than maybe is warranted. But there's enough niche ones here that you can certainly make a quite complex mental geography out of. But this is something I'll have to think a bit more about.
If you compare this with, we are now all the way from Athens to that.
That's a good point.
It's a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes.
Yeah, unless they've got a kind of they're all Romans, yeah, something like that. Yeah, most of these Italian ones are actually from the first 50 years of the documents. Yeah, I wonder if this can be linked up with wars that are happening in Italy and wars in Greece. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really strange one.
Yeah, I think it's a very vague reference to specific reason. I mean, another example would be in the Near East one. If you see the second one, there's Asia Genes. What does that mean? It's a super broad brush. Yeah, something like that. So some of the because this information is coming through from private individuals from all across central Greece, it's not all systematically being done by a single system. We can expect greater or lesser degrees of precision based on the individuals who are selling the information they had, that kind of thing. So it's less tidy than it looks like in my nice little table here.
Yeah. So, in the inscriptions that go under, say, the artist you have just a certain number of paragraphs, and the same holds true for another inscription. Then, if you look at the dimensions, does not carry them. So I was wondering, is that just by chance, or is that because ethnic names were, as we know, quite long time, so you identify the same different languages at the time? Or is it the case that the geography of languages, the demography of languages may be different from the overall, let's say, slave population, which is the case for reasons both.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether that might apply to.
I think that could definitely be true. And a fourth possibility, and one that I'm looking at a lot, is like there was this very interesting article by a chap called Jeff Finn-Paul. Essentially, he comes up with this abstraction of slaving zones versus no slaving zones, and a no slaving zone would be somewhere where the only way to get into slavery there is to be brought in from abroad or to be born to people who are already slaves. Whereas the slaving zone, it's everything can happen: war, debt, selling your children, the whole works. And those are obviously kind of ideal types, and reality will approach the one or the other to differing degrees. But we can definitely tell over time that those conditions change from region to region. I mean, the coming of the Romans is in my opinion, a big change, because you have the provincialization of some of these areas that were previously kind of, all in the slaving zones, where all sorts of things could happen, which doesn't mean that those regions stop producing slaves, but there are fewer wars or no wars, or that kind of thing, and therefore it pushes as the provincialization and the expansion of the empire occurs, this kind of stuff happens over the border. So I'm wondering if essentially Caria becomes more settled, or if the mechanisms, we know from Aristophanes' Wealth there's a carry-on there, and he says he's enslaved because of a little bit of money, so presumably for debt. If that somehow gets stopped by the state, and just as Solon did in Attica, and therefore it dries up that particular reservoir of slaves, and that's why we don't find them anymore. So that's something I'm definitely looking into. Thank you.
Well, really satisfied for the further question. Probably trying to explore sense, but right now I think we'll thank the speaker again for this and more to make it. Thank you.
Yes.
What do you think is the Strabo number?